When we plan out these episodes, we don't purposely try to pick stories, ideas, or themes involving the Columbia Basin Trust, even though they bring you this podcast. We get our staff together, sit around a table, we spitball topics. Then we choose stories we think are really cool, ones that are engaging, stories that you're going to like. But here's the thing. The Trust is so actively involved in the basin that they ultimately have a hand in many of the stories we end up presenting to you. It might be a loan, a grant, professional guidance, courses that they offer. Take this next podcast as an example. We investigated 4 stories we thought would make a great episode on food security, and guess what? Turns out the Trust was involved in all 4 because they believe in food sustainability and because they are committed to supporting this region. So here we go. Enjoy this episode on food. If you truly are what you eat, we here in the Columbia Basin are definitely not local. Let me explain that somewhat confusing sentence with a story. It was 2 years ago. A strange and misunderstood pandemic had arrived on our shores. Well, let's call it our forests. First in Washington state to the south of us, and soon after, the entire continent. I was out grocery shopping just after it arrived, and store shelves were getting sparse, particularly the perishables. Fruits, vegetables, meat, milk. The selection had dwindled to almost nothing. I noticed it was influencing the psyche of shoppers like me who looked nervous, uncertain, afraid. I pushed my shopping cart past a guy wearing a Darth Vader mask, complete with that creepy Darth Vader breathing sound. Really, was that George Lucas-inspired breathing apparatus actually necessary? I hit an aisle that was almost completely bare of product. No paper towels, no napkins, and only one bundle of toilet paper left. This was a respiratory disease, yet we'd cleared the stores of toilet paper. People were quietly desperate and a little panicky. An acquaintance of mine was in the same aisle, a filmmaker. I looked up at her and then at the last of the toilet paper. "I'll fight you for it," I said. She laughed, but nervously, because we both knew it really wasn't that funny. It was creepy. Darth Vader guy creepy. We got through those dark days somehow. Then, just over a year later, food scarcity happened again. The breadbasket of British Columbia, the Fraser Valley, flooded, choking off our food supply for a second time. Shelves quickly dwindled, particularly in the West Kootenay, which relies on the lower mainland for most of its food. We are a rich western province with vast agricultural land, but we don't feed ourselves. We're not even close. 2 catastrophes drove home just how reliant we are on outsiders to provide us with our food. And you know what? It's not okay. I'm Mitchell Scott, Editor-in-Chief at Kootenay Mountain Culture Magazine, and this is The Headwaters, brought to you by the Columbia Basin Trust. On this episode, we're going to chow down on a topic we're finally getting concerned about: feeding ourselves, taking steps towards food self-sufficiency. The Columbia Basin is a region that's sparsely populated. It's largely rural, but it's also rich with agricultural potential. Yet we import almost everything we eat. Outsiders feed us, and a growing chorus of voices says it has to stop. On this podcast, we're going to look at ways to eat and shop local. It all comes down to who's supplying the food we eat. Before we get to our first story, I'm going shopping with someone I would describe as a food guru. Abra Brynne has been sounding the alarm about food self-sufficiency for decades. Abra is a food systems advocate and policy analyst living in the West Kootenay. Finally, our beautiful corner of the world is catching up to her thinking, realizing we've got to return to growing and processing our own food. So Abra, let's start with the definition of food self-sufficiency. How would you describe it?
Food self-sufficiency is when the inhabitants of a particular region can secure their nourishment from that area. By food, I mean the essentials of our diets. Lots of people, when they're thinking about eating locally, they think about going to the farmer's market and buying fresh veggies. But if you think about what you eat on a normal day, we need protein, we need grains, we need veggies, we need fruit. And so if we think about where we live, what it's capable of producing, and how well that matches up with what our daily diets are.
Do we know how close we are to food self-sufficiency here in the Columbia Basin? Has it been studied?
We're not exactly a hot topic for anybody's research focus, but I do think the Metro Vancouver Food Flow Study was a huge wake-up call for a lot of us. I mean, the focus was on Metro Vancouver, but it clearly demonstrated that despite the fact that we have 2 major ports in the province, the vast majority of food that comes into the province, which is across all of our core dietary needs, it's being imported. Most of it flows through Metro Vancouver. It comes in through the port, it comes in through the airport, it comes in through the borders, and then it flows out to the rest of the province, which is why when the highways got washed out, it was such a crisis, because that was our supply line to Metro Vancouver.
Let's bring that down to where we live then. How much do we grow what we eat?
In the Columbia Basin, I've been putting out the percentage of 95% of our food is imported since the mid-1990s when I first started talking about this. And it wasn't based on anything other than my own observations of the food system and a good strong hunch of how they work. Ironically, that's been quoted ever since by all kinds of people. But I do think we've got huge potential here. And the thing is that we're producing a fair bit of food here, even with all the different ecosystems and landscapes and population base here. But a lot of it leaves the area.
Okay, so the big question is, how do we grow and raise more food? And then keep the food we produce in the Columbia Basin? Well, Sydney Black has some thoughts on that. Sydney went and visited a farm in the Creston Valley where almost everything they produce stays local. Sydney, where are we off to?
Well, Mitch, we're off to Kootenay Meadows Farm, which is based in Lister, just outside of Creston, in the most productive agricultural valley in the Columbia Basin.
And it sounds to me, with all the mooing going on, that we're on a dairy farm.
Bingo, Mitch. You're totally right. That's the sound of about 90 cows who are owned by the Harris family, who've been at this job for about 30 years. They're really, really committed to local organic food production.
In what way?
So they don't use any pesticides or chemical fertilizers on the land where the cows graze, and then they replenish that land with composted manure that's from the farm. And then the amazing thing is that they milk their own cows with magical milking robots, which they bottle on site and then distribute all over the Columbia Basin. They also make this delicious artisanal Alpine-style cheese, which gets shipped a little bit further, but everything gets raised, processed, and shipped directly from the farm.
Sounds really good, but it also sounds like a lot of work.
Definitely is a huge amount of work, and I think it's also a big labor of love. So I decided to go on a tour with Erin Harris, who took over her family's business recently from her parents, even though her whole immediate family is still totally involved. Erin ends up working about 7 days a week because farms never sleep, and she's very, very passionate about agriculture, feeding the Kootenays in the Creston Valley.
The Creston Valley is pretty incredible, what we can grow here, and just the range of products that we can grow here is amazing. So, yeah, Creston is kind of that breadbasket that just opens up in the heart of the Kootenays.
Does Creston feed itself or come near it?
Creston could feed itself. I don't know that it does. The Kootenays, and Creston in particular, has a ton of potential, but there hasn't been that many people invest in the infrastructure of finished product processing. So there's a ton of raw agricultural goods produced here, but not a lot that's sent into finished products.
But as you mentioned at the start, Kootenay Meadows is an exception to that.
Absolutely. Erin and her family tried shipping milk by vehicle off-site to be processed, but then it got shipped back in non-recyclable containers. They were worried about their carbon footprint. So they decided to open a bottling facility at the farm, and they bottled and processed all their own product, which is 100% consumed in the Kootenays, in recyclable bottles.
I had so many of those bottles. They're gold.
Absolutely. So our next stop after the cow barn is the bottling plant.
Clean glass is coming out of our bottle washer that's being loaded as we go, and then it comes up the conveyor and onto, it's a rotary bottle filler, so it fills 7 bottles circling around at any one given time.
So how much milk do you bottle here?
So we bottle milk on Mondays and Thursdays, and it's about 11,000 liters per week, all consumed in the Kootenays.
Why is that important to you?
There's a lot of milk produced in the Kootenays, but then it's shipped either usually to Vancouver, Edmonton, or Saskatoon. And that carbon footprint of this really wholesome food product that we produce here sort of affected all of us in terms of the ethics of that. So we thought, this makes a lot of sense. And we were able to then, 100% of our milk, within the first 3 weeks of us bottling, has stayed within the Kootenays. So that was a lot of it, was that sort of externality created by the carbon footprint of shipping that milk that far to be processed and then it coming back in disposable packaging.
So Kootenay Meadows milk is what you see in the glass bottles in grocery stores all across the basin. They really wanted to ship to the stores themselves, so they developed a little fleet of trucks, and now they use those trucks to distribute other agricultural products from producers across the valley.
Wow. Distributors as well. And you said they make cheese?
A delicious cheese that they've been making for 15 years. And they use raw milk right after milking. And then they send it over to the dairy plant and then their cheese plant. It's all processed, aged, and packaged on site at the farm. And that's our next stop.
So yeah, this is our cheese make room. So all of our milk gravity feeds down from the barn. And then we've got 1,000-liter conical-shaped traditional Alpine-style vat, which is where we make our Nostrala, our Alpendon, and our Mountain Grana.
How difficult was that leap into bottled milk and Alpine-style cheeses?
Processing was a whole nother ball game. There is a ton of art involved in creating a good Alpine cheese. Every milk from every different farm reacts a little differently, so there's a lot of development that went into the recipes. The leap into fluid bottling, again, it's a different market that you're serving, where we serve mostly grocery stores with our fluid milk, whereas our cheese is in some grocery stores, but it's in a lot of specialty cheese shops. It's just a different market that you're dealing with again. So, yes, processing was a leap that was fairly challenging.
Do you think all farmers need to make that leap?
I think so, for sure. I also think there's this tension in farming communities that you either have to get bigger or you have to get creative. And for me, getting creative is a lot more appealing. I don't ever really want to be milking, 1,000 cows. I want to milk 100 well and deal with the challenges that come with processing and marketing and distribution, as opposed to the challenges of a large farm.
Whew, that makes me tired just thinking about it.
It's exhausting, and it's a huge amount of work. Erin and her family are dairy farmers, milk bottlers, cheesemakers, product distributors, and marketers, as well as being champions of value-added agriculture products. Erin does it all, even deliveries.
So why not just let someone else handle the processing and distribution?
Because Erin and her family are business people, and they've developed systems that really, really work for them, which Erin is super passionate about.
It's a huge amount of work, and yeah, tons of stress, a lot of financial commitment, and it's not super quaint, but I think it's really important.
Why do you feel like that's important?
For me, it is that seeing people enjoying that hard work you've put in, and that I do really believe that we need to be more responsible in terms of the externalities created by the products that we eat, that we wear, that we use. So I really appreciate that I'm able to farm in a way I'm really passionate about and able to help consumers have a really healthy, option that's local and has minimal environmental impacts.
It must have been quite a leap going from dairy farmers to cheese and milk producers.
Absolutely, but it's what they have to do if they want to be sustainable. So I'm going to leave Erin to sign off with her stars, the cows. I do want you to remember that they do get milked by magical robots, but we'll leave that for another podcast.
One of the challenges of the Kootenays is the lack of infrastructure, and I really feel fairly strongly that we have to take responsibility for that and build our own infrastructure. That's why we have a processing plant in the Kootenays, is because there wasn't an option, so we created the option. But, we produce a ton of beautiful grains here in the Creston Valley, but there's very little processing of that into further products for human consumption. And even a lot of the fruit produced here is exported or shipped further afield to be processed and sent back.
The Columbia Basin Trust is a big supporter of sustainable agriculture and food production. As just one example, the Trust's Agriculture Wage Subsidy Program helps farmers hire employees throughout the growing and harvesting seasons. That increases Basin residents' access to locally grown, healthy food. The Trust supports ideas and efforts of people in the Columbia Basin.
Okay, so we need more business-savvy farmers to step up and produce finished products. But how about us as individuals? What can we do to decrease our reliance on outside food producers? We can grow what we consume. Because let's face it, we've been doing that for decades, with at least one cash crop I can think of. So why not our food? Graham Tracy met a family near Cranbrook that is doing their part. Graham takes us to Apple Quill Farm.
Thanks, Mitch. Michael Albert dices onions in his rural kitchen outside Cranbrook, while his kids do homework with their grandparents in the dining room. Their house is cluttered, but warm, open, and inviting. Michael's making a classic staple, gallo pinto, beans and rice.
Depending on what country you're in, I think where I was, it's Costa Rica. They use black beans. In Nicaragua, they use red beans. I prefer the black beans.
Food is important to Michael Albert and his wife, Marie-Eve. They put a lot of thought into the dinners they prepare for themselves and their two daughters. So much thought, Michael has made growing food his passion and profession.
We've always grown things, my wife and I. My wife being from Quebec. Gardening and agriculture is important there, obviously. And myself from Wisconsin. I grew up with a garden. My dad had a nice garden growing up. It's always a part of our life. Grandfather was a farmer. And it was originally an attempt to provide all the calories for ourselves.
But Michael and Marie-Eve found it next to impossible to grow everything they needed on the rocky bench in the mountains where they built their home. The growing season is just too short, and the soil is thin in places.
We've kind of moved away from trying to do everything, and a lot of that is rooted in practicality and the fact that this is a business. We need to be able to turn a profit. So kind of the things that we thought about is it has to be something that, feeds our soul, not only our bellies.
And so, this family living in the shadow of the Rockies began experimenting with garden crops. Marie-Eve says it began with staples at first.
We started with just a kitchen garden, beets, carrots, stuff like that for the family. And then we had a few chickens for eggs, and then we tried meat chickens, and then it just kind of snowballed from there to a greenhouse with more square footage than the actual house we live in. These are shallow.
No, I got shallow ones. I was going to give them a try.
That greenhouse is just outside their home, about the size of 2 sheets of curling ice. It's bright and warm. They just installed new heating with a loan from the Columbia Basin Trust.
We were lucky this year to get a loan from them in order to be able to install the heating system. We've also used some of the consulting services, business advisory, help with bookkeeping. Yeah, just great networking.
Michael and Marie-Eve experimented with all kinds of crops, settling on greens and tomatoes as their main crop, with a long row of raspberries outside.
I think we're going to do more tomatoes this year, but raspberries traditionally have been pretty good. One of the problems in a greenhouse is it's a controlled environment. So it can't be too humid, it can't be too dry, it has to be, just right. And when you want to try to get your square footage to count for something, you need to put as many things in as you can in a row. We're starting some beets over here, and the cilantro is looking a little bit thirsty too, so I gave it some.
The family sells their harvest at 3 farmers markets in the East Kootenay: Kimberley, Cranbrook, and Fernie. The COVID-19 pandemic was a setback for them, but this is now Michael's full-time job. He estimates they grow about 40% of their family's calorie intake and sell the rest. He's given up being a wedding photographer to grow food and hasn't looked back.
Farmers markets are fun to go to, and you get to meet your farmer and shake their hand. At least in the past, you get to shake their hand. And you can see what they have to offer and see the passion that they have, because everybody there is passionate. Well, it's considered a farm gate sale, and that's kind of the way we like to do it.
It's a dream. It's a local farm that's providing a few different produce and berries and meat to a very local market. Yeah, we're kind of homesteader, foodies, became farmer. That's kind of that in a nutshell.
This is our chicken coop. We've got ducks and geese in here. And they've all got different personalities.
Michael and Marie-Eve say it's a lot of work growing food, and you must be ready for challenges. Marie-Eve still works outside the home as a veterinarian in Cranbrook, while Michael experiments with new crops and growing methods. They are leading by example, and Michael thinks people in the basin are becoming more aware of what they eat.
The biggest reward in doing this, I feel, is the community that we're a part of. Our ancestors, way back to the beginning of agriculture, I feel connected to them. I feel connected to my animals. I feel connected to the plants. You know, so many times people come to me like, oh man, that pepper was so great. What was that? And that just makes me very happy to be able to provide that for them.
You know, being able to feed our family, being able to feed people locally, being in touch with our food system, going back to values of preserving and eating seasonally, raising 2 little humans that are really aware of that, that's the reward.
One of the biggest challenges of getting packaged foods to market in the Kootenays is the processing. Making jam from berries, juice from apples. It takes a large inspected kitchen, machinery, and a distribution system. And it can be daunting, unless you've got some help.
Yeah, so now we're in the food processing part of the food hub, and this is where we'll be helping people who want to use our bottling machine or our freeze dryer or our juicer, and we'll do the work on their behalf. And so this is a way that small-scale food processors, they won't need to buy their own equipment. They can use our equipment on a fee-for-service basis, and what they would normally take 2 weeks to do, they could do probably in 1 day here.
Elizabeth Quinn is Executive Director of the Fields Forward Society in Creston. They own and operate the Creston Valley Regional Food Hub to help farmers do things like wash jars or juice their products, label them, get them to market.
What it is an industrial scale food processing facility. We're providing food processing equipment for small scale food processors so they can scale up. Food processors do not want to buy their own equipment, so this way they can use the shared use equipment and build their business. We already have a food culture, and we have a lot of agriculture in Creston and the East Kootenays and in the West Kootenays, but we want to scale up by having food processing facility to provide people with opportunities to realize their creative dreams. I find that food processors are incredibly creative people, and they just want to do things and try things, so they can try it here, test the product, and see whether it's what they want to do. So the long-term vision is to not only process food, but also to organize it all and put it on a truck and have it delivered. And there was a study done by the Columbia Basin Trust, a transportation study in 2019, and they found transportation was the biggest barrier for a lot of smaller scale producers and food processors. So we're already overcoming that barrier.
that's our podcast. It wouldn't happen without the Columbia Basin Trust. Bob Keating writes, produces, and edits the Headwaters. Peter Moynes is photo editor and executive producer. Tara Cunningham and Vince Hemsall are our story editors. Stacey Machowski does our digital layout work, and our reporters for this episode were Sydney Black and Graham Tracy. I'm Mitchell Scott. Thanks for listening.